All right. Good evening, everyone. Um, and welcome. I'm Maya, the Program Associate for Village Preservation. I'm so glad you're here with us this evening. I'm just going to say a few words about village preservation, and then we can hand it off to our speaker for tonight, Raymond Crozier. Here at Village Preservation, we have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We have secured landmark designation of more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks. We host 75 free programs a year, and our events cover a wide range of topics focused on the history, architecture, and culture of the Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo, and the important role of historic preservation in our communities and our lives. We look at the role of everything from local small businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights and social justice movements, great artists, writers, musicals, dancers, and others connected to the creative legacy of our neighborhoods, as well as the irreplaceable and unique built environment of our neighborhoods. We are a member-based organization, so your support is essential to enabling us to provide this free programming for our community and continue our advocacy and preservation work. If you like what we do, join or make a donation, and you can scan the QR code right here. Learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation at villagepreservation./donate. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. If you have any questions for our speaker specifically, please use the Q&A question. No need to wait to submit your questions. We'll get to all of them in our Q&A section after the presentation. And just a little bit of last housekeeping. I want to also let everybody know that we will be having a second Zoom webinar this week. It's going to be Thursday, March 21st at 6 p.m. It's going to be Jane Jacobs, Champion of the Cities, Champion of the People, where we'll be talking to the author of the first biography of Jane Jacobs, specifically for young adults. I'm so delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Raymond Crozier. He is the honorary professor of psychology in Cardiff University, Wales, previously head of psychology in the University of East Anglia, Norwich, England. His book, Patchin Place, The Powys's and the Literary New York, was published in England in 2022. And I'll hand it over to him.
Sorry, my slideshow was hidden by the screen sharing sign. There we go. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It feels somewhat strange to be talking from Wales to New York about New York, but I've really been interested in Patchin Place for some time, and I'd just like to share with you some of the findings of my research. Just, I'm sure you probably all know where it is, but just to remind you, it's from this plan. You can see it's from the center of the screen, and it's really at where 6th Avenue, at West 10th Street, and Greenwich Avenue sort of form a triangle, and it's in the heart of that. You can see Washington Square Park just in the bottom of the screen. And this is just a view more looking south, and you can see on the left-hand side of the screen 6th Avenue running down, the tower of Jefferson, what's now Jefferson Library, but at one point this was both a courthouse and a prison. And this cluster of trees here is really Patchin Place and neighbouring Milligan Place. So it's right really at the heart of Greenwich Village. And I really would like to start thinking about the owners of Patchin Place. And really we can trace who owned it right back to 1731 and Admiral Sir Peter Warren and his descendants. And Sir Peter Warren was a British naval officer, an admiral, and a politician. And he uh, won prizes, that is, money, from successes in naval battles. And in fact, he won something like 127,000 pounds, which would have been a huge sum of money in those days. And he also married in 1731 a wealthy Susanna de Lancey, and between them they bought what was called the Peter Warren farm. And this gives you an idea of the extent of it. I mean, farm doesn't really do it justice. It really runs from Chelsea to Soho, and from the river across to Sixth Avenue and part of Broadway. So what we can do is trace really the successors of Sir Peter Warren, and we can see that smaller and smaller bits um, are 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 sold until eventually um, they were sold through from his descendants to Samuel Milligan. And really, this is where Patchin Place as we know it now begins, because Milligan bequeathed the estate to his son, who in turn bequeathed it to Aaron Patchin, who married Milligan's daughter. And this took place in 1799. So I think one of the striking features of this is that how few owners there have been over the years. And I'll look at each of these owners very briefly in turn, but you can see that there are three owners in 174 years, so it's hardly ever changed um, hands. And really, the bit that we've been looking at here is really a plot of land which was involved Patchin Place, Milligan Place, which is a small group of houses adjacent to it, and some properties fronting Sixth Avenue. And this cluster really has survived up until the present time. So as I say, Aaron Darwin Patchin on the top right was married as Isabella Milligan, so that's how it came from Milligans to be um, uh, Patchins. And they had three children, Thaddeus, Isabella, and Josephine. And Aaron Darwin arranged for that cluster of houses to be built, and they were built in Patchin Place in 1848 and 1849. The other properties were built. So the next really development that takes place is that in 1896, the estate was sold in two parcels in the New York real estate sales room. And the surprising thing about this is that both the parcels were put up by the Patchin family and were bought by the Patchin family in two lots. So this is, I was kind of really puzzled as to why this should be the case. And it seems that the New York Supreme Court ordered the estate to be sold in two parts. And a partition sale is when not all the people entitled to ownership will agree that it should be put in the sale, and the court can order the sale to take place. So Isabella Dorsheimer, the daughter and Thaddeus's widow, purchased Patchin Place and 113 West 10th Street for $81,000. Henri Noctel, a Parisian, who was Josephine's widower by now, purchased Milligan Place and numbers 114 to 119 6th Avenue. So it's difficult to understand really why this sale took place and why it was sold in two parts. And one clue to this, I think, is that in Natalie Noctel, who was Dr. Noctel and Josephine's only daughter, went to court to say that her father had defrauded her out of a fortune of $82,000, and that in 1895, that is before the sale, he had bullied her essentially into signing over the deeds to the property to him. So this must be in some way tied in with the sale and the division of the property. We do find that, in fact, they seem to come back together eventually, and were owned by Grace Ingersoll Patchin Stewart, who was, I can just remind myself, she was Thaddeus's daughter, and she eventually became the owner of what we now know of as Patchin Place. But just to give a kind of idea of what it looked like at that time, we've got these two um, early photographs. This one taken in 1885, and essentially this is a Patchin Place looking towards the Jefferson courthouse, and there are 10 dwellings in this small cul-de-sac. There are 4 on the west side and 6 on the east side. And you see this side of one of the buildings in West 10th, behind one of the buildings in West 10th Street is really occupies the first spaces on the west side. And then another early photograph, 1915. I'm not sure who the photographer brand actually is, but this is looking the other way, and you can see the distinctive ailanthus trees in place. So it's thought that originally the courtyard between the two terraces was originally grassed over, but even in these early photographs, that's not the case. The distinctive iron fire escapes are already in place at the front of the building. In 1917, indoor plumbing, electricity, and steam heating were added to the Patchin Place. Interiors, by 1920, interiors were converted from rooms to studio apartments, and there seemed to be something between 50 and 60 apartments in this 10 houses. I'll come back to that in a moment. And in 1929, the gate at the front of the alley was erected and appears in later photographs. And I think this edifice here, the tall pipe, is a chimney for a basement boiler. and steam heating from basement boilers, networks of underground pipes that was typical of Patchin Place and also quite widespread in Manhattan. The next change of ownership, the Grace Stewart sold Patchin Place to Jane Keenan. And again, there's some surprising elements to this business as well. So this in 1905, this is a census entry for Hugh Keenan, who's the son of Bernard Keenan and to be Jane Keenan. You can see that the Keenans were originally Scottish, and that Hugh was born in the United States. But what's so striking is that Hugh's occupation was given as a stenographer, and his parents were janitors of the block. There's rather a mystery how they actually afforded to purchase the estate, but they did purchase it, and Hugh Keenan became the the owner, and for very many years. Again, we can see some photographs, and these ones we're now looking at the 1920s and going on to look at Hugh Keenan's period of ownership, and these were taken. Ones I'll show first were taken by Jessie Harbour Yield. She lived between 1870 and 1942, and was one of the first photojournalists, and certainly one of the first women photojournalists. She was accredited by the New York Herald before moving to Manhattan and setting up a studio with her husband. And we also some of these very atmospheric images of Patchin Place to her. And this is looking in the opposite direction, again by Beals, is looking towards the Jefferson courthouse, and you can see the very distinctive architecture of Patchin Place here. Very sort of simple designs, the very distinctive fire escapes, and of course the ailanthus trees that are still there today. And this is a photograph of herself, and you can imagine taking this enormous camera around the vicinity. It must have been quite a challenge for her to do that. This is probably a very well-known photograph. This was taken by Berenice Abbott in 1936. And again, it's looking from West 10th Street to the back of the alley. And Berenice was born in Springfield, Ohio, in 1898, and attended Ohio State University. She spent a very productive time in Paris, where she worked with the artist and photographer and surrealist Man Ray, before setting up her own studio with the financial assistance of Peggy Guggenheim, very wealthy Guggenheim family. And in 1935, she began working for the Federal Arts Project. This is during the great economic recession of that period. And she produced a set of 305 photographs of Manhattan and the outer boroughs. And she was living in Greenwich Village at the time. And now the photographs that she's bequeathed us really is of the Jefferson building. And this is the elevated railway that ran right down 6th Avenue. You can see that in the foreground. And then West 10th Street moving up here, and then Patchin Place being in there. So the prison and courthouse would have been part of that complex. Okay, so that really takes us up to Hugh Keenan's ownership. But just in terms of preservation, E. Cummings, whom I come on to, the poet, lived in Patchin Place, and he credited Hugh Keenan with the survival of the alley in the face of threats of demolition. And he wrote in 1958, "Miracles never cease. A certain diminutive dead-end lane of 100-year-old houses hasn't yet been, and while an extraordinary mortal named Hugh Keenan lives, probably won't be, supplanted by one of those hugely hideous hyperboxes teeming with moneyed subhumanity, which his partner Marion Morehouse long christened as hatcheries." So Keenan did manage I suppose, the survival of the fabric of Patchin Place in that sense, although he did fall out very bitterly with Cummings when he tried to evict Cummings. He wanted, because by that time, I'll come on to Cummings in a minute, but that time he occupied most of number 4 Patchin Place, and therefore he deprived Keenan, of course, of the rent that he could receive by having more tenants within the building. And it was actually people who campaigned on Cummings and Morehouse's behalf, and approached Mayor Wagner in City Hall, and he sided uh, with Cummings, and that change didn't take place. So after Keenan, of course, Jewel, he owned these for very many years, but in fact up till 20 and 22, under companies of slightly different names. So again, the fabric of Patchin Place survived under his um, ownership. So now I'd really like to turn to some of the literary associations of the close. And I'm going to start with the English or Anglo-Welsh, really, novelist John Cowper Powys, who lived from 1872 to 1963, and he spent most of his life as an itinerant lecturer, lecturing on literature right across North America, United States, and Canada. He was perpetually on train journeys and going from one city to another, giving lectures and moving on. Apparently, he was quite a remarkable lecturer. He was married and had a son back in England, and he sent most of his earnings back to them, and he lived on next to nothing. And when he met a young American woman called Phyllis Playter, they started a relationship, and they moved into Patchin Place, where they lived in number 4 between 1924 and 1931. She wasn't very happy with Patchin Place. She didn't like it at all. and because the facilities were so poor. But I think he was so unsure about cohabiting with someone who wasn't his wife while married. He really wanted to live fully anonymously, and Patchin Place afforded that. He began his first major novel, Wolf Solent. He began in in Patchin Place, and he was there while he was writing it when he wasn't also uh, off lecturing. It's actually set in Dorset, but he also wrote a book called After My Fashion, which I think was 1919 he wrote. It wasn't published until 1980, and it's of interest because it really describes it's set in the Manhattan of the 1920s, and when he lived in Greenwich Village. I think that's quite interesting. Thomas was he wrote a lot of letters. He wrote a lot, kept diaries for many years, and these give a very vivid picture of life in Patchin Place. So maybe I could just read out some of what we've learned from his writings, what life was like in Patchin Place in the 1930s. And he was living in number 4 on the top floor of the building. So he had a small 3-room apartment at the front of the building. The largest room, the living room, has a window overlooking an ailanthus tree. A screen divides a gas stove from the rest of the room. There is a fireplace with a mantelpiece above it. His apartment was unheated and relied on a coal fire. There is a bed which serves as a couch during the day, a bookcase, and a chair. The second room, or alcove, contains a large wooden chest and a dressing table where the women of the flat can perform her toilet. The smallest room, the anteroom, has no window. It functions as a storeroom, and the tin bath is stored here, brought into the living room for bathing. The toilet is 2 floors down. Fire is permanently lit in winter. Baths are taken in the alcove behind the curtain and a yellow screen. Very little cooking took place in the room. They would take their breakfast and other meals at Childs, which was a chain of cheap restaurants, or the Brevoort, which was a hotel where lots of the kind of bohemians of the period lived. And Mrs. Bertel cleans the room for them. That they take laundry to Mr. Hoyt, a laundryman, who brings the clean items back to the apartment. There are frequent parties in the alley. On occasion, there are loud arguments, even physical fights, and sleep is disturbed by revelers. The poet Hilda Doolittle described number 4 as sordid. Others called it shabby and depressing. Gamel Woolsey, who lived number 5, was warned by a doctor that she wasn't receiving enough daylight. We'll have a look at how gloomy the Patchin Place was in a minute. And everyone was disturbed by the howling of women prisoners from the Jefferson prison at night. So it was a really difficult place to live in. This is a photograph of Llewellyn Powys, who was also a writer and John Cowper Powys' younger brother, and they're with their cousin, Father Hamilton Johnson, just prior to Llewellyn Powys marrying Elise Gregory. Let's say something a bit more in a moment. So they're in the courtyard behind number 4, Patchin Place. This is Llewellyn Powys. This is, I think, a number 5 that is taken, and he's living in Patchin Place. Time. And this is a photograph of him with Elise Gregory. Now, Elise Gregory married Llewellyn Powys. Prior to that, she had been living in in Patchin Place. He was the first really to live there before John Cowper Powys or Llewellyn. And after working in a shop and in advertising, she got a post as editor of the Dial, which was the leading modernist literary magazine of the period. And it was funded by two millionaires, Scofield Thayer and James Sibley Watson. I'll say a bit more about them in a minute. So another person who lived very briefly was Isabel, who was the niece of the brothers. And as a young woman, she came over um, to New York, and she found herself an apartment in Patchin Place, next to Llewellyn, as it says above the join in the letter, and opposite Jack or her brother John Cooper. So she says, now you can see that there are Powyses at numbers 3, 4, and 5 Patchin Place. And she says that she paid $13 a month for the property, which describes as having a sitting room, a small bedroom, a kitchenette, and a small dressing room. He has a coal fire and a small gas stove and a sink, but no bath, electric light, or telephone. Next resident, and the one that's most widely associated with Patchin Place, is the poet E. Cummings. And this photograph, he lived in number 4, from September 1924, and he lived there for 40 years until he died there in 1964. He was always short of money, and it was James Sibley Watson and his wife Hilda of the Dial who subsidized him and enabled him to live there. And he started off with one room in number 4, but eventually, and after he had met his long-term partner Marion Morehouse, eventually they took over just about the whole property, and also had a room which she reserved for herself, at number 8, Patchin Place. So he was there for a very um, um, long time. But again, a description of their rooms where the furnishings were minimal and beat up. The couch sagged, chair legs held together with twine. A throw covered the horsehair protruding from an overstuffed easy chair. And as I said earlier, Canaan had attempted to evict Cummings in 1960, but was unsuccessful. Um, Cummings had a long-term partner, although they never married, although she was sometimes called Mrs. Cummings, Marion Morehouse, and she was a fashion novel model, sorry, and eventually became a well-known photographer in her own right. So she took the previous photograph of Cummings. This photograph of her just shows how gloomy you can see that the Patchin Place would be, particularly in winter. This is a photograph of Cummings in his room in Patchin Place in 1937. And this is a photograph of Hildegard and James Sidley Watson. As I say, they really financed Cummings, enabled him to live in Patchin Place when he was earning hardly anything from writing his poetry. And I think there's a broader interest really in this, because Watson and Schofield, they kind of employed Alice Gregory and then eventually Marianne Moore as um, editor. But there was a whole group of poets that surrounded and were part of this circle. And often they would meet in Patchin Place, have parties, have dinners in apartments. So Patchin Place became quite an important arena, really, for uh, poets and writers at at, at the time. And there was just one thing before I leave Morehouse and Cummings. There was a plan in 1953 to demolish Patchin Place and Milligan Place and replace them with an apartment block. The residents were very strident in their opposition to this, and Doris Deether and other activists again managed to get Patchin Place rezoned so that it couldn't be um, redeveloped. So that was one sort of threat that Patchin Place has survived. I very briefly refer to another uh, novelist, Djuna Barnes, who again, she lived here, as you can see, from 1940 to 1982. She'd she was American, but she moved to Paris and spent very many years there. And she was a member of a kind of a lesbian group led by Natalie Barney, and they kind of mutual support. And during this period, she wrote Nighttime, which is her most famous novel. But when she reached Patchin Place in 1940, again, she was penniless, and Peggy Guggenheim stepped in again to pay the rent, and she stayed there, living more or less as a recluse until 1982. Apparently, she did manage to fight off a burglar and a mugger in her time there. She's just standing, just see the famous gates behind her. And then, very briefly, a very short term um, residents were John Reed and Louise Bryant. They lived there together. Started in 1918, and just come back from Russia, and he wrote his very famous book, 10 Days That Shook the World, about the Russian Revolution. He returned to Russia in 1920, but was imprisoned en route, took ill, and died in 1920, and was buried in the wall of the Kremlin, which was very rarely an honor very rarely given to non-Russians. Louise Bryant stayed on in Patchin Place until 1923, when she moved out and remarried. And 10 Days That Shook the World, because we made it a movie, Reds, by Warren Beatty, which is really worth seeing, because at the end of it, many of this period of this generation are interviewed as very, very elderly people. Other writers and artists in residence, I just list some are longer than others, but you can see some very well known figures, including Marlon Brando. Very briefly, his sister lived there. John Cage, the musician, Eugene O'Neill. There's several past 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 passed through. Again, it was just such an accessible place. It seemed to be easy enough to get into a property, to get out of a property. Rent seemed to be cheap, and so on. And I just end by what seems to be almost typical event uh, taking place. And this was Dudley Diggs. This is the actor on on the left. Irish-born, he appeared in many movies, including Mutiny of the Bounty with Charles Laughton and Clark Gable, and Emperor Jones with Paul Robeson. And he lived for a while in Patchin Place, and a group of them put on a performance of a play by William Butler Yeats between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning. And this took place in combined gardens of several houses in, as you say, in Patchin Place. And they seem to be in the backyards, as it were, of a number of the houses. And this was mounted for charity. It says the performance was witnessed by an audience of about 300 people. There seemed to be an orchestra in a kitchen, and the rumor was that they managed to persuade the elevated railway company not to run trains during the hour in which the performance took place. And we've actually got a photograph, again by Jessie Tarbuck's Beals, of the play The King's Threshold, which is in the Radcliffe Institute of Harvard University. And you can see it's quite a sizable cast in costume, and quite a large audience in the foreground. And in many ways that sort of characterizes sort of the spirit of Patchin Place. I think that the residents would have come together to do that. This is a contemporary view of the yard behind number 4 Patchin Place. I think this would have been the kind of area that where the performance would have taken place. Just to finish, I've a book, This Patchin Place, The Past in New York, is now available from Amazon as an ebook and a paper book. There's also another book, it's very hard to find, but it's by Boyne Granger, We Lived in Patchin Place. And it's Boyne Granger who provides a description of the performance of Dudley Diggs' play. She also typed up John Cowper Powys' novel when he was writing it in number 4. It gives a very good description of what life was like at that time. Okay, and I think I've just about hit the time at a 1:45. So perhaps I can hand you back to Maya, and Maya, she can see if there's any questions that you might ask me to try to answer. Okay, do you want me to stop sharing or what?
Yeah, you can stop sharing. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I very much enjoyed it, and I'm sure other people did as well.
Okay, thanks.
So if anybody has questions, please put them either in the chat or the Q&A. We have our first question is, how did you get interested in Patchin Place?
I became interested in John Cowper Powys, the novelist, and I read a lot of his books, and when I learned that he lived in Patchin Place, I went to New York. I think it was 1995, I think, and I made a kind of pilgrimage to Patchin Place, and I've been a few times since. It's such a fascinating street with fascinating history, and I only really in the last few years began to wonder about Patchin Place rather than thinking about it more generally, think, well, what was it really like when he lived there? So I began to kind of research research into it, and the more I learned, the more interested I became in it. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's a fascinating place. I was wondering if you possibly knew how much the rents were for a room back in um the 1920s
Well, I
when
think
Powers was.
yes, I'm not sure. I think Isabel Powers paid about 16. I think it was $16 for that suite of about three rooms. I saw later on that Cummings and Barnes were paying about $50, which seems a lot, but that was maybe 1950s. Maybe they were paying that. But I think that the rents were very modest, and um, looking at the kind of census data, there were a lot of people. There were some families, but a lot of the rooms were just people passing through, as it were, and not someone that they would want to stay for long periods of time. So I suspect, in looking at the jobs that they were doing, they didn't have very much money. But of course, in recent years, it's become pretty pricey, really, to to live. They're very expensive. It became offices for psychiatrists, notably. And although I did write an article on Patchin Place, and a resident wrote to me and said, some of us don't have very much money. It's not everybody's a millionaire who lives here. So of course people could be on controlled rents and so on. But I don't think artists would afford to live in Patchin Place after the 1950s, 1960s. I suspect they moved to other parts of the city, I think.
Mhm. Um,
She,
yeah, we have another question uh, by an anonymous attendee. They say, I lived at 9 Patchen Place for 6 years from
wow,
1968 to 1974. You
that's
paid
fascinating.
$54 for a fourth floor walk-up. I was interested in how Manny Duell came to buy the building. He was my husband's uncle.
Yeah. Well, Manny Dwell was a wealthy property developer. He really owned quite a lot of properties in uh, in New York. So he bought it sort of off the Canaans, and he's maintained it he's owned it ever since until 2022 under different companies' names. But I'm pretty sure he owned blocks of apartments and right across Manhattan, not just Patchin Place was just part of a portfolio of properties. So I think he saw scope for development, and I'm sure he was frustrated when um, the resident Marion Morehouse and the residents actually managed to get Patchin Place rezoned. It made it harder for him to develop. I'm sure if he had his own way, he would have replaced it with modern apartment blocks, packed it with people. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a few questions about the current owners. Do you know who owns it now and possibly how much it was sold for in 2022? I know a lot of people are very anxious about
Oh,
if it's selling.
yes. Well, I should know that. I've written it somewhere. I can't. It's sold. It's Firebird Grove is a development company, and I think it has got a very wealthy German backer who's invested in a lot of properties in Manhattan. But I can't, at the top of my head, remember uh, what it was cost. It was a lot of money, that's for sure. It was a lot of money. But I think your website has got that details. if the readers want to look it up, because that's where I read about it first, and then I followed it up in kind of real estate magazines. But I think your website has it alerted me to it that I hadn't realized it was sold. And somebody I just saw somebody saying on the screen that they'd got it number 4 completely, and I've seen that. I've seen photographs of what it looks like. Um, no, and it bears no relationship to to what it was. And somebody else wrote in to say that they'd evicted all the tenants. I'm not sure if that's true, but they just made them all leave. So if anyone knows about that, I'd be interested to find out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I do believe that one person asked, is Patchin Place landmarked? I do believe it is, since it's
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
historic district.
It is. Yeah.
Another person also asked, what was the connection to Jefferson Market? Um, Back then it was, of course, the courthouse, but now a library. But if there's, do you know if any sort of if that sort of showed up in the sort of literature or poetry of the residents, or they're
Um,
influenced by
um,
it?
I think I think some writers did look at. I think it was a women's prison specifically, and I think certainly the residents found it very hard to cope with the with the the angst that they could hear coming out from the women in prison. I imagine it was pretty basic um, conditions. Jefferson Courthouse is famous for the trial of Ulysses, James Joyce's novel. Was tri- it was tried for um, um, indecency, really, and there was a very famous um, court case, and actually John Cowper Powys appeared as a witness for the defense. He wasn't living in Patchin Place at the time, but he turned up to um, give evidence. It had been seized by the U.S. Customs, and they refused to release it for um, sale. So that's written up quite a lot in the literary books, that particular trial, because it did involve quite a lot of literary people giving evidence and so on. And the Little Review, which was a modernist magazine at the time, they serialized parts of it. So the two women who owned the Little Review, they were in the dock, and they risked going to prison really um, for it. So yeah, that was that was
Hmm.
probably its most famous trial, I guess, in many ways.
Hmm. All right, so we have one more question that says, we always understood that James Beard lived at Patchin Place, and we're told that Patchin Place was built as workers' housing, or is that sort of a rumor or so?
Well, some people have suggested that it was built for the waiters who worked at the Brayford Hotel, but I don't think the evidence really um, hold, uh, holds up with that, partly because it predates the Brayford Hotel, I think. But if you look at the census, I mean, people were really they were like tenements, I suppose you would say. That if you moved into a house, there would be several families or several individuals in rooms, and you'd have the most basic kind of um, facilities. That's um, certainly how the Kenyans ran it when they were um, in charge. They just packed people in and provided very basic um, facilities. So it was always I mean, that there's a kind of property that often artists are attracted to, because it's so cheap, it's so easy. There's big turnover of of, of residents and so on. So you can find somewhere to live. So most of the occupations of the residents were all working class essentially, and and relatively poor. But some of them you would find, and like even in number 4 Patchin Place, you would find a family of maybe 4 living in a couple of rooms, you know. So it was not where people would choose to live. I,
Yeah.
I think, yeah, yeah. And I looked at the censuses, and hardly anybody stayed. If you look at the 1921 census and then 1931, it's completely different people. Only people like Cummings and Djuna Barnes stayed for long. Most people were in and out when they could find somewhere better to live, I think. Because
Mhm.
it wasn't an attractive place then to live. It is now, but it wasn't then, I don't think. Mhm.
I missed this question, but one person's really interested. Were you able to find any photos of the interiors at Patchin's Place back in the day? Or
No, not really. Just the glimpses of the Cummings that I showed, and the well and past. Just no. I took a photograph of myself in 1995 of the lobby of one of the rooms. I mean, the door was open, so I sneaked a photograph. It was very, very basic, really.
Mhm.
No, very, very basic indeed. Yeah. Hmm.
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking me. I've
Oh, this is
enjoyed giving it, and I hope the people enjoyed listening to it and watching it as well. I hope they've learned something about Patchin Place that maybe they didn't know before.
well, I definitely learned a lot about Patchin's Place. So always
Yeah.
walk past it, but never learned the full history. So this was great.
Yes. Oh, that's good.
So I just want to
Okay.
thank you very much. Have
Okay.
a wonderful night, everyone.